Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today, instead of looking at a gun, we are taking a look at a sword. This is a Japanese model of 1935, aka Type 95, non-commissioned officer's sword that came back from the Pacific during World War II. It's actually been in my own rifle collection for a little while. I got it from my father, who got it from the veteran who brought it back, although I don't have the exact story myself on exactly where it came from or circumstances of capture. But these are pretty darn common in the United States relative to other Japanese swords because it was a non-commissioned officer sword made specifically just before and during World War II, and a lot of them were available to be captured because for the Japanese, having a sword was a significantly important, it was a cultural status symbol. And if you were an officer in the Japanese military, you absolutely had a sword. And as an officer, you had a fairly fancy, nice sword. If you were a non-commissioned officer, it was still important to have a sword as part of that badge of office. This linked you back to the samurai tradition. And so they needed a lot of non-commissioned officer swords, more than could be made from proper traditional art swords, the really nice ancestral swords that are in some Japanese families. So instead, they set up basically a manufacturing process, a manufacturing line at two different army arsenals to produce katanas, essentially. Now, Headstamp is actually in the process of printing, we are pre-ordering right now, a book, an identification guide to Japanese swords from the 1870s through the end of World War II. And I figured this would be a really good opportunity to see what our new book has to say about my Type 95 here. So, a little bit more context. In the 1870s, when the Japanese military started to westernize, when the country opened up to the wider world, they got rid of a lot of the samurai tradition, or they got rid of a lot of the surface elements of it. And in particular, military swords were changed to European styles of swords, especially European style of fittings, the hilts, the handguards, that sort of thing. The Japanese military was styling itself very deliberately after the first-tier European militaries of the time, the French, the Germans, and the British. Now, this would continue into the 1930s, at which point you get a wave of nationalism that starts to really take hold in Japan. And one of the effects of this was on the military, an interest in going back to a lot of the what we're seen as the samurai traditions or roots of the military. And so in 1934, a new sword pattern was adopted. And instead of being traditionally European styled, it went back to the traditional Japanese katana, specifically a style from the late 1100s through the early 1300s. Now, in 1934, an officer's version was adopted, and in 1935, a non-commissioned officer's version was adopted. This is the 35. A few of these swords were made with the new style, and by the way, this was called the Shin Gunto, or New Army Sword, to distinguish it from the Gunto. I apologize for my Japanese pronunciation, but the Gunto was the old military swords, which were the European pattern ones. A few of these were made by taking family ancestral heirloom blades and fitting them with the new pattern of fittings. For the non-commissioned officer swords, that would be an extremely small number. The officers were much more likely to actually have an heirloom sword in their family that they could use and actually do that to make a 1934 pattern with a modern blade. For the non-commissioned officers, what you got was a factory production line machine-made blade and set of fittings. So let's take a look at this up a little bit more closely, and let me show you how they actually did this, because it's a modern factory product that is pretty well made, I think, to look and handle like an old traditional style Japanese sword. Traditionally, a Japanese sword would have a handle, a very fancy, finely crafted handle wrapped in something like manta ray skin. For a machine-made factory product going to every sergeant in the army, that's not really a practical option. And so what they did was create a casting that replicated or that duplicated the style of a properly hand-wrapped sword. And if we take a look up even closer here, you can see that this duplicates the original thread that this would be wrapped in There are a couple of cherry blossoms here as embellishments. That's the screw that holds the handle onto the blade. We have another cherry blossom back here. This is actually a really nicely made casting, I think. These were, the very first few of these were actually made in solid copper. This was, as I said, the pattern 1935. Production actually began in 1937, and it would be simplified over time, relatively quickly, in fact. So originally this is solid copper. That was changed to aluminum, and that's what we have here, is a cast aluminum handle, but still really nice detail, I think, to the casting. There were a couple versions of the handguard here, the Tsuba. Originally they were manufactured in solid copper or bronze. They changed eventually to iron, and that's what this one is. The early ones had a nice bit of decoration on them. They were a little fancy. The iron ones here are just very plain, round, functional, but really nothing special to them. On some of these, especially I think the earlier production ones, you will find a series of 3 manufacturer stamps and approval stamps here just behind the Tsuba. This particular one, and many of them, especially the later production ones, don't have those stamps. Instead, what we do have is a serial number and an inspection mark there. This one was manufactured by the Tokyo 1st Army Arsenal. They were also made by the Nagoya Arsenal, and the whole program was actually administered by the Kokura Arsenal. If you can't identify these little inspection stamps, there are actually 2 Nagoya ones and 1 Tokyo inspection stamp. You can actually discern the blades because the Tokyo Army Arsenal ones are, the serial numbers are stamped so that you can read them with the blade down. On the Nagoya ones, the serial number is upside down. So you hold it with the blade facing up and you can read the serial number. These are machine-made blades, so there's no hamon, there's no line here indicating where the sword was differentially quenched like a proper antique katana would be. They were made with a fuller to reduce weight while retaining the strength of the blade in theory. Some of the late war ones, they got rid of the fuller just to reduce manufacturing cost. There is no special folding, 1,000-fold super fancy traditional katana type stuff here. This is made from billet steel. The heat treat on some of them was decent. The heat treat on some of them was not so great. This is much more, think of this as functionally more of a machete than a historic katana. But it's got the shape of a katana and it fills the sort of the social role of having a katana. This one, unfortunately, I suspect some veterans' kids or grandkids at some point did some good guy, bad guy, rough play with this blade because it's had a rough life there. You can see a bunch of nicks and chips in the blade down here. We have a scabbard here, and this one's rather hard to read. In fact, I don't know that you can read it at all, but there is a serial number up here that should be matching to the blade. This one is. Not all of them that you find, of course, will be. This has a really good coat of its original green paint still on it. And you can see, down here, originally this would be a metal, on a traditional katana, this would have been a reinforcing piece to protect the end of the scabbard. Of course, this is all single piece machine fabricated, so it's just one component here, but you get the look, again, of a traditional blade. And these have a single ring as a hanger, and then we also have a hole up here, and that is for the locking catch right there. Holds the sword in the sheath. Standard design was to have this on top. There were also some versions that had it on the side. Actually, for a right-hander, I think it would have been on this side. But this is the more typical pattern. This is a second type specifically, as recognized by the collector community. Fancier swords, by the way, for higher ranking officers would have a tassel or knot on the back end. They include the hanger for that on this one, but no high-ranking officer is going to get one of these rather low-level swords. There is, of course, a question of, were these things actually used? What was the real point of giving swords to every sergeant in the army? In fact, it's interesting, for the officers, there were even short officer blades that were issued to guys who were officers, but in situations where you really didn't want a full-length sword, like pilots. But nonetheless, it was important culturally for those guys to have swords as a badge of their rank and place in society, even if it meant a little dinky one that you could fit in the cockpit of your aircraft. Anyway, were these used as military weapons? No, not really. This would be, if you think about it, an officer's handgun is fairly rarely used. The sword would be even less important in a very practical sense than the handgun. They were used in a leadership role. They were obviously symbols. They were used in things like banzai charges, which were not militarily practical or intelligent operations. They were used as perhaps a disciplinary tool. Some private gets out of line, you can whack him with the flat side of the sword to put him in his place. And unfortunately, they were also used in war crimes, essentially. There were probably a non-trivial number of, well, definitely a non-trivial number of Chinese civilians who were murdered with swords like this. Not necessarily specifically these things, but their use was not strictly military. It was, more civilian, occupational, and perhaps disciplinary. So you would think that maybe they would, well, if you're not familiar with the Japanese military of this period, you would think that a country would stop making swords late in the war when the material resource situation became really dire. That is not the case. There was, in fact, a follow-up pattern to this, specifically designed to use even less strategically important material, like we're going to stop using aluminum. And they went to using wooden handles on these. Those swords got really crude, but they went on producing swords right up until the very end of the war. And those, in fact, are also in Blades of the, sorry, it's over there, Blades of the Emperor. In addition to these guys, the 1934s, 1935s, there are a bunch of examples of these with different features. It was really cool that the book allowed me to do a very nice job of identifying specifically what pattern I have here. And that's, of course, in addition to all of the other European-style swords that were used before the 1930s. So if you're interested in this subject, of course, I think you really ought to check out our new book. It is available for a discounted pre-order just until the end of the month, so only a few more days. After that, the price will go up about $10. It is being printed in the US. It'll be, well, we have a timeline of probably about 6 months to actually ship the books. There's a major paper shortage going on at the time of this filming, and that puts a serious delay on the printing process. But it is a beautiful book that does a fantastic job of allowing one to identify the whole range of imperial swords from the 1870s to the end of World War II. So check it out. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.